Hello, my name is Maria Lamardo. I'm a senior accessibility designer at CVS Health, and today I'll be talking to you about accessible forms. First, I would like to go over what web accessibility is. Well, the web is fundamentally designed to work for all people, whatever their hardware, software, language, location, or ability. And if we're building accessible applications, we're doing just that. According to the UN and the W3C, there are over 1 billion people worldwide who live with a disability. That makes up about 15% of the world's population. And they have a total of $6.9 trillion of spending power. There are different types of disabilities, and each of these types is going to affect how the user interacts with the web. There are motor disabilities, visual disabilities, cognitive, and auditory, and more, but we're going to focus on these today. For motor disabilities, users might rely on voice recognition or eye tracking software, or even adaptable keyboards, whereas visually impaired users might be using screen magnification or screen readers or even Braille. For cognitive disabilities, we have to be aware of the language that we use in our application and that we're reducing the cognitive load for our users. For auditory disabilities, we want to make sure that we're providing captioning, transcript, or sign language videos when appropriate. How do we get started? Well, we can start small and take easy wins. And we're going to go over some of these easy wins today. And of course, we want to make sure that we're designing and carefully crafting our content so that we can improve accessibility and that it can support accessibility. We want to make sure that we're using good semantics and that we're using the right HTML element for the job. And of course, we want to make sure that all of our interactive elements are accessible by a keyboard, and that all the users who are using a keyboard can access and navigate through all of the content. So let's talk about form structure. The HTML form element is user-created form for user input, and this can hold many different types of elements, listed here. We will be going through some of these different elements soon. Before going over these, let's take a look at a standard form. Here we have a very simple form. It holds two input fields. One of them is for the first name, and the other one is for the last name. One of the things I want to point out here is the keyboard functionality for forms. When I use the form element, I am able to submit the form using the Enter key. For example, after filling in the form, I can stay in the last name input and press the Enter key. And you can see that my form actually submitted. Let's take a look at this in the editor to see what happens if it was wrapped around a div instead. I'm going to go ahead and press my Enter key. And as you can see, nothing happens. In fact, even by pressing the Submit button, it won't submit anything, because we've removed that behavior, and now we have to actually manually add it. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to form. And you can see that we have action and a method. And when the form is submitted, this form handler, which is provided here by the action, is actually going to process the input data. Using the correct semantics of forms will also allow users to access this content with other tools. For example, VoiceOver allows me to jump to different content. So let me turn on my screen reader, and I'm on a Mac, so I'm using VoiceOver, which I can easily turn on with Command F5.
Chrome busy.
Next, I'm going to move through the form elements with Control Option Command J.
First name, last name, edit text. You are currently on a text submit button. You are currently on a button inside of a frame. To click this button, VoiceOver off.
So you can see that allowed me to jump through all of the elements inside the form. Aside from making sure that you're using the correct semantic elements, it's also important that you consider the placement of the content inside your forms. It's very important to keep the labels close to the input fields. Let's take a look at an example where this is a problem. In this next example, you can see that there's a form with an input field and a phone number. We can see that there's a label to this input, but it's way up here. And if a user is using a screen magnifier, and it would look something like this, then it is really hard to find out what the label is with all of this content in the middle. And users will really have to scroll all the way up to see And even then, it might not be very clear that that is the label attached to this input field. And although they're semantically paired and the screen reader can hear the label, it's not accessible for all users. So keeping the content close to each other will improve this experience. Another pattern that we want to try to avoid is using CSS to move content visually without changing the order of the DOM. In this example, we have the exact same form that we had before, but we have floated this paragraph and this icon to the right. Although this looks better for visual users, users with screen readers can still go through the content and it might feel out of order. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen reader.
Chrome busy. VoiceOver on Chrome.
And VoiceOver actually has this quick nav on feature, which you can turn on by hitting right and left arrow key.
Quick nav off. Quick nav on.
So now that I have it on, I'm going to just, with the arrow keys, go through the content inside my form.
On phone number. Phone image. At Vero EOS usum as edit on 10W. Unselect submit button. VoiceOver off.
So you could see that the focus of this content was moving around the page, and it was very confusing. So it's best to simply change the structure of the DOM when needed, rather than using CSS to visually change your application. Next, I want to discuss the colors in our forms. We want to make sure that colors are not used as the only visual means of conveying any information. In this example, you can see that the instructions say that all red fields are required. But this can be very difficult for users to distinguish. I'm going to turn on my colorblind simulator. Here you can see that color red is not very visible for some users. And to meet the standards, we must have instructions that all of our users can perceive. In this next example, we see that the required fields are clearly defined for all users. And we have a visual and clear instructions. You can also see that we're using a required HTML5 attribute and the ARIA required attribute to inform users that these fields are required. The HTML5 will provide some validation in most browsers. Let's open this up to dig in a little bit deeper. So here we have two input fields, and they each have the required attribute. So if I try to submit my form now, you could see that the browser is prompting me to fill out this field. Once I fill out this field and I try to submit again, then I'm prompted to fill out the next one. But what happens when I remove the required but leave the ARIA required? Well, when I try to submit, it does prompt me to fill out my first name, but when I try to submit now, it actually does allow me to submit. So the required attribute for HTML5 is what is actually blocking me from submitting the form. And if we inspect this input field, and actually I will remove the required attribute from the second field, and let's inspect now. So if I'm inspecting the second field, and I'm actually going to be looking at the accessibility tab, let me make that a little bit bigger for you. Okay, here we go. So we have two input fields. The first one has the required and the second one does not. And you can see that here, the invalid user entry, the first one does have it true, because the required is catching that it is not filled, so it is making it as an invalid entry. Whereas this one is not an invalid entry. So when I try to fill this out, you can actually see that it's no longer an invalid user entry, same as this one. And that is what allows me to submit the form. We also want to make sure that the color that we do use on our form meets the color criteria standards. Let's discuss this a little bit further. As I showed you before, different types of color blindness can drastically change the color. As you can see here, the color wheel to the left is what someone without a visual impairment would see. Then, on the right, are different types of color blindness and how they would perceive the same color wheel. This clearly shows the issues with relying on color alone. To help us, we're provided with a set of standards for color contrast. Here, we see the different color contrast ratio we must meet to meet the WCAG 2.1 standards. This will make our content more accessible for more users. So we can see, to meet the WCAG 2.1 AA, our normal text has to have a ratio of 4.5 to 1, whereas for large text, which is defined as 14 points and bold or larger, or 18 points or larger, you must meet a 3 to 1 ratio. For all user interfaces, you must meet also a 3 to 1 ratio. For AAA, you need 7 to 1 for normal text and 4.5 to 1 for large text. Here, I've provided a color contrast checker, and you could put the background and the color that you're using, and then it's going to update the value for the color contrast, and it's going to tell you which criteria you pass or fail. Notice that you can also see what happens to the user interfaces. Although this can help, you can still meet the standards and not have an accessible application. With this in mind, make sure that you try to avoid colors that are too high in contrast, as this can be very difficult for some users to read. Next, let's explore how we can provide accessible labels and instructions. We will begin by going over a few ARIA attributes that are going to help us with this. First, we have ARIA label, which can provide essential information about an object, and it is mostly used for icons or in cases where the text label is not visible on the screen. Whereas ARIA label by establishes a relationship between objects by ID. Let's take a look at what this means. Here we can see that we have two different search input fields. Now, although we don't have a corresponding label, we are setting the label for this input with ARIA labeled by. And you can see that this ARIA labeled by is actually matching the ID of the element that we're targeting. In this case, it is the search button, as we want those contents to be the label of this input field. And you could see the same is true for the second input field. So we have ARIA labeled by, and we're pairing it to the ID of the button. Let's open up our DevTools and see what's happening. So in here, you can see that the name of this input is actually search, and you can see that the content is being wrapped from that button. Now let's discuss how we can use ARIA label here. Since we have two search bars, and let's pretend that one of them is going to belong in the navbar where we could do a site-wide search, and the other one could be for looking up specific items on a page. And as you can see, I'm using a role of search for each of the forms. This allows us to come up as a landmark in the rotor tool. Let's discuss what that means. Here's a list of landmarks. Landmarks are used to section off your content of your page, and they can have their own unique purpose. For example, we have a header with a row of banner, and this will hold our logo and our website name, and it can also hold our title. Then we also see an element for aside or complementary, whose purpose is to support the content of the main content. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I do want to call attention to this one here. Although there is no HTML5 element, you can see that there is a role of search, and this section contains the search functionality of the site. So let's go back to our example and see how this is picked up by screen readers. I'm going to turn on my screen reader, and I'm going to turn on something called the rotor tool.
VoiceOver on Chrome.
You can open the rotor tool by hitting Control-Option-U.
Landmarks. Node.js. Result. Search. 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 Search.
So you can see that I have two search landmarks here.
Search.
And if I was a user trying to navigate this page through a landmarks, it's kind of hard to differentiate between both of them. And it is something that I should be able to do. And this is a great way to use ARIA labels, since this content is not a text that is currently on the page. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen reader.
VoiceOver off.
And I'm going to set ARIA labels for each of these. So I'm going to go ahead and open this in the editor. So for each form, I'm going to say an ARIA label. Let's pretend that one of the searches is for a site-wide for the web, and the other one is for accounts. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my rotor tool again.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Items. Landmarks menu. User menu. Site-wide search. Accounts search. Site-wide search. Accounts search.
So as you can see, that's a lot more informative than it used to be. And you can see how we can use ARIA label by to match to existing content, and use ARIA label to create content that isn't visually on the page. Next, I want to discuss the difference between explicit and implicit labels. As you can see here, I have two input fields. For one of them, the label is explicitly set. That means that we have a label which is paired to the input by an ID. Whereas for the second input field, we're actually wrapping that input field in the label element itself, and that's where it's getting the label. So as we inspect these elements, we can see that they're both grabbing the label, and this one specifically says that it's grabbing it from the wrapped label, whereas this one is grabbing it from the label by ID. And when they're paired correctly, you should be able to activate the input by clicking on the label. Now, explicit labels are better supported than implicit labels, so always try to use explicit labels wherever possible. Another thing we have to consider is how we're providing instructions for our users. There are a couple things we have to follow. We want to make sure that the instructions are close to the input fields. Also, make sure that they're clear and easy to understand, and we can use ARIA described by to describe input instructions. ARIA described by provides an extended information of what the user might need, and it works a little bit like ARIA labeled by, since it's paired to another element via ID. We want to place instructions on a form so that users know what type of data is expected. Instructions or labels may also specify data formats. Let's take a look at an example. The first thing I want to mention here is the use of placeholders, as we can see in this first field here. Now there are a couple of problems with using placeholders to inform the user of things like data formats or even using it as labels themselves. The problem with that is that by default, you can see that it's a little bit gray out and it is not meeting the color contrast standard. Let's open this in the editor. If I were to change the color to meet the color contrast, then now it looks like it's pre-populated data. And that's also not what we want. On top of this, as the users start typing, you can see that we actually lose that content. And if these are being used for providing instructions or format structure, then the user has no way of knowing. And it can be very difficult to fill out applications and reviewing applications as you might not know exactly what was needed. Users are not going to remember the content that was inside the placeholder. Ideally, all instructions and data format are part of the label, like we could see here. Or they could also be paired to the input field by ARIA described by, as we discussed earlier. So let's take a look at that. Here we have a form which has a label and an input field, and we're actually setting an ARIA described by, and we're pairing that to this content here. And that's actually going to pair it to the input field. So let's inspect that. So you can see that it has an accessible name of name, which is coming from the label, and it also has a description of first and last name. So let's turn on my screen reader and see.
Voiceover on Chrome, instructions, Google Chrome, Maria, name, edit text, first and last name. You are currently on a text field. Voiceover off.
So you could see that after it was done with the label, then it went and read the description of this input field, which is a great way to provide instructions for users. Next, we're going to be going over input types. There are many different input types available to us. And next up, I want to focus on the input type of image. So you can see that I have an input field here that is of type image, and you could see how it appears on the page. I want to show you how this is actually turning this image into a button. And if we inspect this element, we can see that it actually has a role of button. So as I'm using my screen reader, we can see that it is picked up as a button. And not only that, but it also has all of the keyboard functionalities for a button. So I can submit my form with hitting enter on that button, or by hitting space. Alternatively, you can also wrap an image in a button element, which you can see here. Now, adding something like this, ARIA hidden equals true, is going to hide any content for screen readers. And you can see here that I've actually hidden this visually, but it is still available to screen readers. So when I'm actually tabbing to this button, it's going to read this content.
Busy. voiceover on Chrome, search button, account search button, search results for auto, search voiceover off.
So there you go. And then I'm visually hiding it with this. Make sure that you're not using display none to hide things visually when they are needed for screen reader users. Here we have some other input types, and I'll be discussing the checkbox, radio, and select. Checkboxes and radio buttons are very similar to each other in a couple of ways. Let's first take a look at checkboxes. You can see that each option in the checkbox has an input and a corresponding label. However, since the label is attached to the input itself, we still need a way to pair the question or instructions for the users to the checkboxes. We can do this by adding a field set and a legend. The legend represents the caption for the content parent, in this case the field set. So let's take a look at how this behaves with my screen reader. There are a couple of things that I want to mention for keyboard functionality. Users expect checkboxes to be able to tab to all the options, and you should be able to check and uncheck each checkbox by hitting the space key.
Box, granola bar, unchecked checkbox, select your snacks, group.
So you could see that it read the option, it told me that it's an unchecked checkbox, and then it went ahead and it read the legend for me. So I am able to know what the option is and what I'm answering.
Checked, granola bar, checkbox, mixed nuts, granola bar, checked, checkbox.
Next, I'm going to be moving onto the radio buttons. The expected keyboard functionality for radio buttons is to be able to tap to the set, and using the arrow keys, you should be able to navigate through all the options. If you hit tab again, you should move on to the next element.
Mixed Apple Pop Angular radio button, 1 of 3, choose a framework, group. Vue, selected,
For select menus, the expected functionality for keyboard is to be able to tap to the menu and use arrow keys to select an option. You can use the arrow keys to navigate between the menu options and spacebar to expand. Once you're inside, you can press the space or enter key to collapse the menu.
Tacos, which is your food? Collapse, tacos, macro, hamburger.
Some browsers also support being able to filter these options by letters. So let me open it again and type the letter T.
Hamburger, tacos. You are currently on tacos, which is your food? Collapse, voiceover off.
One of the common mistakes that I want to pause and talk about here is when applications automatically submit a form on selection of one of these options. And you should not change content on a user without first informing them that that's what's going to happen. For example, if this was inside a form, then I should have a submit button, so I should be able to select an option and then hit submit. Else, I should be warned beforehand that selecting one of these options would lead me to another page. Let's talk a little bit about mobile. Let's discuss how these inputs fields can affect mobile users. Here, I put these different types of inputs, and feel free to play around with them on your own. I took a couple of screenshots of a couple of different input fields for my mobile device. As you can see, there's different types of inputs here. As you can see, setting different types of inputs will open different keyboards for mobile users. Here we have text, number, color, and telephone keywords. On this slide, we have month selection, week, and daytime local. So make sure that you're using the appropriate input type depending on what you need from your users. Next, I want to talk about button types. This will allow you to perform different actions in your form. You can see here that I have typed button, reset, and submit. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out some of the form. And then I'm going to hit each of these buttons. You can see that the button type does not do anything, whereas the reset button will clear out my form, while the submit button will submit my form. Another thing that really helps users to fill out forms is autocomplete. There's a huge list of autocomplete attribute values for you to use. You can set autocomplete to on for the entire form, or you can set specific attributes for individual inputs. And this is going to help people with cognitive disabilities, as they don't need to interpret the purpose of each field. And this is helpful in case some of the labels are not familiar to them. In this example, I have actually set the form to autocomplete, as you can see here. This is in the form element. This will allow the browser to try to autofill all of the input fields. However, because it's not explicitly told what type of data is expected in each field, the browser uses its own judgment. In the second example, I set autocomplete for each of the individual input fields. So you could see here, I have autocomplete on for a given name, which will fill out my first name, and I have not done anything for the second input field, so you can see the difference. So you could see that you could set it form-wide or for individual field. And I really encourage you to check out this list as it provides a lot more options. Here we have some phone number input fields. In the first example, we see that the phone number is broken up into 3 different fields without any visible labels. The second example is the same, except it has visible labels. First of all, you want to make sure that you're not breaking numbers into distinct input fields. First, we want to make sure that each field has an appropriate label for all users. And we also want to make sure that it makes sense. A lot of these segments that are broken down are not very meaningful. Another practice that is not very accessible is changing focus automatically when input fields are being filled. For example, in this input field, as I fill out the form, you saw that the focus automatically changed to the next field as I filled it out. This is an issue because users know the functionality of input fields, and they are already expecting to tab as they finish, so they might have already tabbed by the time this automatic focus happens. So they might be on the next input field. So we don't want users to have an unexpected experience. In order to meet the accessibility standards, you can do this by first making it clear to the user that this is expected behavior for these input fields. And here we have the same thing happening, except we can clearly see the labels. However, it's best to just skip all of these in one input field, and you can use masks to format the data as desired. There's a lot more to forms that I did not cover here today, so I really encourage you to look through the documentation and see how to implement some of these features. Here are a few resources. The first one, it's the slides to form snippets that you saw me use for my talk today, and a few other tools that can help you create accessible content. If you have any questions on today's talk, or you or your company need accessibility consulting, please feel free to reach out. I would love to talk about accessibility. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.